Good morning.
Good morning.
This must be my last presentation, and when you're summing up what you have planned to present to your class for a whole week, or sometimes ordinarily for maybe more, a little longer than that, when you do the last presentation, you get some mixed feelings, because you begin looking at what you intended to do, and then you look at what you've done. And if it's a class setting like it is elsewhere, you really know that you have the same students sitting before you, and you also know that you're going to hold them accountable at some point through things like quizzes and exams. But in a chat setting, your students are revolving all the time, so you don't know whether they are followed and whether to introduce the new piece of information that we might have. So I'm looking at my presentation today. I need to cover something on the Sabbath, I need to cover something on the sanctuary, and then tie up together. And I don't know that that is doable within this time span we have, but let me just make an attempt to make some highlights. Now, when you're thinking about important movements, sacred history, it's interesting the way the Lord works. There's a general principle that we have found in the sacred history, how God works. By the way, God is predictable. No, God is consistent but not predictable. Right? I think you want to write that down. God is consistent but not predictable. His ways agree with his general nature. He's a holy God. But you can't predict that because he did it this way, that's how he will do it tomorrow. He's different because he's God, and he relates to mankind in a fallen situation of sin, and much of it depends on how man will respond to God's gracious work. And God is great, is consistent because he's a loving God, and he always overcomes sin using various ways. To that extent, therefore, he's consistent. But how man responds to God's intervention dictates how God then proceeds with how he works. So God is consistent, but it's not necessarily predictable. So we may not see that the way it works. Yet, having that said, as I introduce this subject, I want you to know that, let me go back to Abraham's day. When God introduced the sign of circumcision, was that the first that man ever to be circumcised? Let me hear your point. Pastor, do you know? No? When Abraham was first told to circumcise as a sign, a covenantal sign between him and Yahweh, was Abraham the first person to be circumcised? Do you know? No, you may not know. You know, he was not the first. There were other people that were being circumcised, but the reason of their circumcision was different. And so God used something that was existing in culture and transformed it to give a spiritual meaning. Circumcision that was given to Abraham was a covenantal sign, spoke to the relationship, special relationship between God and Abraham, signifying the circumcision of the heart. What about the sanctuary? When Moses was given a sanctuary in Exodus chapter 25, verses 8, was the sanctuary, was that the first time a sanctuary was being put in place in history? Again, not necessarily. There are communities in the neighborhood that were having structures, and archaeology has revealed that there are enough archaeological finds of sanctuaries. Yet God transformed it into something that gave a new meaning. Another thing that again I want to give you is that the church, ecclesia in Greek, was the concept of the church, which is the Greek word, whose Greek word is ecclesia, something that was introduced by Jesus in the New Testament. No. Ecclesia was what you call today the MCA Parliament in Kenya. In the Greek times. And so Jesus simply pulled it out of the secular world, political world, and transformed it and gave it a spiritual meaning that the MCAs of those days were people called out to their parliament to act on behalf of the people. Now, Jesus says, no, now I'm calling out you as Christians to act on behalf of heaven. Ecclesia or church is a concept that is given a spiritual meaning. Another one, baptism. Another rite. Was baptism necessarily something that Jesus brought when he spoke about it in John chapter 3? Not necessarily. Baptism was something that was happening between what we call Second Temple communities. Second Temple communities existed after the Jewish nation came from captivity in Babylon. From that time on until Jesus' day, that period was called the Second Temple Judaism. And baptism in that generation was practiced as a way of heathens being converted into Jews. So if you wanted to become a Jew or to be accepted as a Jew, you either were born as a Jew or you are co-opted into Jewish religion. And the only way to be co-opted was through baptism, and it had very mystic meanings. Now Jesus took that and transformed it into a New Testament teaching of second birth. So in the same way, in the last days, when we're talking about the environment of the Middle-Earth movement, again, we see the same things. God using things that were obtaining and transforming them to give a new meaning. One of which is the idea that when you have been baptized, when you have received Jesus, you must have a testimony and you must have a public confession of the sin. They are not necessarily from heaven or biblical, but God always comes to man where he is so that he can lead him to where he wants him to be. I need to say that again. God always comes down to where you are as a people, as a generation, so he can take you to where he wants you to be. What sin does is shrinks our ability to relate in sanctified ways. And we perceive reality, spiritual reality, in certain ways. For example, the idea that when you speak in open, confess in open that you're saved, is a humanistic understanding of what it means to be saved. Of course, to be saved has nothing to do with confession. It has to do with your heart experience. Yet, because that's where the 19th century Christianity was, God used that because that's where they were to take it to where he wants them to be. I'll give you an example. In the 20th century Adventism in Kenya, bride price was an ethical practice of solemnizing families that are doing marriage, right? If you wanted to marry somebody's daughter, by giving bride price, you are giving an affirmation that you appreciate that family for their effort and also that you're committed to the safety of this woman that you're marrying. And that reduced chances of polygamy and immorality and just dropping off a girl that you pick from somebody's family and then you abandon her. If you give bride price, chances are you're committed. But it's not necessarily that that's what heaven ordains. You understand? That simply speaks to the ethic of commitment. You're committed to whoever you're married. chances are you're going to give those animals you're committed to this woman. You think again if you're to abandon her. And she also think again if she has to walk out of that marriage because she knows it will mean you have to return the animals. And that's a Herculean task. So, bride price was accepted as a way of commitment to each other. And secondly, bride price spoke to the idea that the man is mature enough to work to sustain the family. And that's important. How would you rate that a man is mature enough to provide for the family? If you are in those contests, chances are you can work to sustain your family. What about today in the 21st century? Does it still obtain? Not necessarily. The idea is the commitment. The form of it is different. The 20th and 19th century got behind. The only way you know that a woman is committed to her husband is if she has been paid for bride price and she has given back to kids. You know she's going to walk away. And the only way you know that a man is committed to his wife is when he gives the animals. Right? But in the 21st century, do we do that? No. It's another way of doing it. The concept being, you must demonstrate that you're committed. And so is it with religion. Church is dynamic. The sanctuary doctrine was not necessarily exclusive to the Israelites, just like it was not necessarily exclusive to the Mennonites. The Mennonites were reflecting what was obtaining at the time of the 19th century. And when William Miller spoke about the sanctuary, many other scholars were teaching about the sanctuary. What Miller did was to give it an eschatological face. When he looked at Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, he understood that the cleansing of the sanctuary might mean certain things. And I'm going to list them for us. I don't know whether my brother can be able to type them as I read them out. Number one, Miller thought that the sanctuary might mean Jesus himself. So, he was trying to come to a conclusion. What's the meaning of the cleansing of the sanctuary in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, with regard to it being cleansed in the end time? So he said, one of the options, you can tell that this guy was a scholar, yet he was not a theologian. And I want to challenge members of the church here. You don't have to be a theologian to be a fine student of scriptures. You just need to be disciplined and then ask the Lord to give you his measure of the Spirit. And I can guarantee if you do that, it's not telling how much you can go. You can go so deep. Then I know you love scriptures, and I can challenge you. If you apply yourself consistently, you can go so far. Miller wasn't a theologian. He wasn't one of the leading scholars of his day. Yet history reports that among the scholars of this generation, Miller is one of them, without any theological background. Miller was out of the sea. For all we know, he later on became a surgeon. And some of the things he writes, even me, I have to say, wait a minute, this is something. How did even come there without any formal theological training? So he said, in William the Daniel chapter 8, verses 14, the cleansing of the sanctuary, what's the sanctuary? Then he says, number one, the sanctuary could mean Jesus. Number two, the sanctuary could mean heaven. Number three, the sanctuary could mean Judah. Number four, the sanctuary could mean Jerusalem temple. Number five, the sanctuary could mean the inner compartment of the Holy of Holies within the Jerusalem temple. And number six, the sanctuary could mean the earth. And lastly, he said the sanctuary could mean the saints. Very well reasoned options. He's looking for a way to conclude what could the sanctuary mean. in John chapter 8 and verse 14. What would have led you to think like that? And he carefully goes for data in scripture to look at each of those options. 7 in number. By the way, this is around 1840. Then he wrote, not the first, that is not Jesus himself. Why? For Christ is not impure to need cleansing. If you say that Jesus is the sanctuary, then you must conclude that Jesus is a sinner to need cleansing. Because in Daniel 14, it says the sanctuary must be cleansed. Then he dismisses Jesus as a sanctuary because Jesus cannot need cleaning. Cleansing, that's logical, isn't it? Then he says, number 2, it cannot be the second, which is heaven, for that is not unclean. Heaven is not unclean. Reasonable, isn't it? Very reasonable. Not the third, that's Judah. For literal Judah, by the way, does not exist. Literal Judah was expanded from history and from the face of earth in the Batch-Koba War in 133, 135. Historically, the nation of Israel came to a grounding halt in AD 70 when Jerusalem was sacked and the temple destroyed. But in AD 133, 135, as a nation, they ceased to exist. They were uprooted, never again to exist as a nation. And what you have out there today as Israel is not necessarily Israel. It's a conglomeration of many nations politically put together by the UN in 1948. Right? Then he said, option number 4, the temple. No, because the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Are you writing? Yes. The sanctuary can mean the temple. And Judah said, no, the temple cannot be Jerusalem, cannot be the sanctuary because the temple was sacked in AD 70. Then he said, what else? Can it be the inner compartment of the holies of holies within the Jerusalem temple? Again, the same reason. That does not exist. The temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. So it cannot mean that. Then he came to number 6, the earth. And William Miller thought that must mean the earth, because the earth needs cleansing. That's why, in his understanding, the cleansing of the sanctuary, if it meant the earth, therefore Jesus must come back on earth with a fire to cleanse the earth. And for him, the cleansing of the earth was also the judgment hour of the earth. You can see how he reasoned. But it's systematically. Now, that was captured by many living contemporaries of Miller. And I think of people like Joshua Hines. By the way, in the Adventist hymnal, I've looked at the Adventist hymnal at the introductory preface. Do you have it? Anyone with the Adventist hymnal? Do you have it? Just come down with it, please. I know you just open that book and you sing your songs. You've never looked at the back of that book. You've never noticed that there's a guy there that is part of our Adventist heritage. I hope you have it. I'm sure you should have it. Yeah? Yes. Can you find where Joshua V. Hines is? At the back. No. Somewhere here. He's somewhere there. He was one of the people who led out the compilation of our Adventist hymn as early as in the 1840s. Joshua V. Hines. It's not there. Not this way. It should be here. Yes. There should be Joshua V. Hines somewhere. You check carefully. You see it? If you read carefully, you find Joshua V. Hines as one of what pioneer of music. Just read carefully through it and then you find it in our know. Yes. Joshua V. Hines was one minister who really helped in the publication of the views of William Miller. Another one was Samuel S. Snow. He really led out in the discussion on the sanctuary. These were leading people. Now, when you find Joshua Leach later on coming on the scene, these were the prevailing thoughts and discussion on the sanctuary. Now, let me go back quickly to another because of time. I think, in fact, my time is up. Let me just mention something small about the Sabbath. You can visit my sister so that you have found it? It's been mentioned. Can you read it? That's earlier where it's mentioned. If you look at your Adventist hymnal, in the preface, you'll find what she's just reading.
Okay. James White recalled that in the early days of the Advent movement in America, there was a power in what was called the Advent singing, such as what was felt in no other, like Incidents with 94. From the beginning, Seventh-day Adventists have been singing people. The very first book they published was in the 1849 collection of hymns for God's peculiar people that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. James White published 5 hymnals and 4 supplements even before the church was formally organized in 1863. White drew freely from the musical heritage of the Methodist, Baptist, and other denominations. He also carried forward some of the white spirituals from the millennial harp of Joshua V. Hines and added a few other hymns by Adventist authors Uriah and Annie Smith and Roswell F. Cottrell.
You notice that? Yeah. By the way, let me tell you something about James White. He had 13 weeks of formal schooling. 13 weeks elementary. And yet, he rose from that to become the president of the General Conference. Think about it. 13 weeks. And he went to school when he was around 16 or 19 years. I can't remember. I don't know whether you remember. Either 16 years. He came from a poor background, so he never had the privilege of going to school. So when he was 16 or 19, I don't remember, he went to school for 13 weeks. And then he got a job. Then again, he self-educated himself and became an editor. Can you believe it? Don't play with God. And mingled with leading theologians of the day. Joshua V. Hines, that was a respected theologian. Samuel S. Snow, another leading scholar. But Miller, an illiterate, and James White, another illiterate, mingled with them and worked and served God. So there is no excuse, as Jkia should. There is no excuse. By the way, how much schooling did Ellen White have? Grade 3. And you will go to the grave, never have written as much literature as she has written. On a myriad of subjects. Just in case I'm distracted, let me just read something here for you guys. And then I will conclude. There is so much to cover, Elder Matata's SOP. I'm spoiled. I don't know what to say. I just need like 3 months just to give you a lecture. There's just so much information I want you people to know. But let me just read something here small for you guys. And I'm looking at the concept of the Sabbath. Let me just mention this. The Sabbath as a doctrine did not originate with Adventists. The Sabbath as a doctrine was first reported among Puritans in England. The first time it came to the United States of A was when a man called Stephen Mumford landed in Rhode Island. That's when we find the first written records of the Sabbath being reported in the US of A. And from that point on, that's 1664, by 1800, there were about 1,000 Sabbath-keeping Baptists in the US of A. Not Adventists, but Baptists. So, the first report of Sabbath-keeping in the US of A was a man, Baptist Adventist. No, Baptist Christians. Not the Adventists. By 1840, the number had risen from 1,000 to 5,500. Now, I've been looking at literature. How come Seventh-day Baptists were not successful in pushing the Seventh-day Sabbath as hard and as fast as Seventh-day Adventists, who later received it, have been able? Seventh-day Baptists are very few around the world. But Seventh-day Adventists are 22 million. They have really grown. They have impacted. And the denomination of Seventh-day Adventists has impacted much more. What's the reason? That brings you to the ministry of Ellen G. White. It was because of her ministry between 1844, 45, and 1849 that the Adventist Sabbath, which she received from Betts, Joseph Betts. And where did Joseph Betts get it from? From Rachel Oakes. Where Rachel H. Oakes got it from? She read from the pamphlet of the Baptist Sabbath keepers. The Baptists who began pushing from 1840 to 1844 the doctrine of the Sabbath. And so Rachel Oakes came by it, and when she read the pamphlet, she got convinced. And so she gave this pamphlet to Betts. It's Betts went and met the Whites and gave them this pamphlet and tried to educate them about the same. And at first, James White and Ellen White didn't think that was truth that needed to be taught. But later on in a vision, she was shown about the Sabbath in Revelation, and then when she read it, they began to realize the Sabbath was an important end-time doctrine. She gave it an eschatological relevance. She discovered that up in heaven, there is a sanctuary, and in the Holy of Holies, there is the Ten Commandments, right? And in the Ten Commandments, she was taken inside in the Ten Commandments. She saw the first table, and on the fourth commandment, a holy glow surrounded it. And so from there, she realized this is an important teaching that needs to be taught. Can you see how God works? Now let me ask you a question. Agamatata, one of these days we'll organize maybe a weekend symposium when I can talk a little bit more about that. But let me ask you a question. Have you noticed the way God is using he goes out and uses people who are not necessarily his own people to advance the truth, right? Can he do it even in the end times? Look, he was bringing up the Millerite movement to become Adventist, but he used truths from other faith communities, right? Including in Israel's day, he used truths from other sources to bring them to alignment. In the 19th century, Adventists were not keeping the Sabbath. Ellen White didn't keep the Sabbath. She didn't even know about it. But he brought it from other sources to make them realize this is true that they should be understood. Do we think as Adventists we have the monopoly of truth? Or God can use other sources to help us have the truth of the earth? Let me challenge you. As we go forward, let's be open to the leadings of the Lord. He can use any source to let us know that the end is here. in Christ's day, who reported that Jesus had been born? The Magi from the east, right? Were they Israelites? No, they were not. God's ways are beyond our way. He can use anyone to help his people know something. In my research work in graduate school, discipleship is not our strongest point as adults. After you agree with me. And when I had to do that research, it's my thesis in Revelation 14. Can you believe it? Is there discipleship in Revelation 14? You will not see it. And that's why we've been weak on discipleship. But I discovered that all along Revelation 14 speaks to discipleship. And we saw the gospel by being sentimental. So where did I turn to find the information? To none and to scholarship. God can use people from that to teach us things we don't know. As Adventists, let's lower our arrogance, denomination of pride, and be open to the leadings of the Lord. If there's anything that history teaches us, if there is anything that SOP teaches us, it is that the Lord is consistent but not predictable. God is not man that can predict and say the way he did it yesterday is the same way he will do today. The consistent thing that is God is holy, his nature is the same. But how he works around issues, he is God. And he can do things the way you have never thought. Now, Ella Matata, because this is the last day, I know that people may have a few questions or a few additionals. Can I just take maybe, if you allow me, a few questions, one or two? Because this is my last presentation today, tomorrow I will be in. Anyone with a question or an addition or something we need to clarify? I remember you asked a question. I think I really answered it anyway. Do you remember your question yesterday? I think I did answer it. I promised to answer it, but I went ahead and did something about it. If you remember, before I sit down, you can flesh it out. Any other question, any addition?
He was asking if we can still get another prophet.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah.
Let me see. Let me give you a biblical answer. Right? If you look at Revelation 12, verse 17, the Bible says, and the dragon became enraged with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who obey what God tells them to do and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. That's a very plural statement, right? It's not a child, it's offspring, plural. And the possessive pronoun who tells you that it's plural. And that's in keeping with the Bible, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, prophecy is not limited to a person. It's given to a church. So the spirit of prophecy does not belong. Even though Ellen White's life demonstrates it, but there are people in the church who may not necessarily do it the way she did it, but they have the gift of explaining prophecy in a way that even when you listen, you're like, wait a minute, I didn't know that. Dan, have you seen that? So the manifestation of the spirit of prophecy is given to the church, the Reverend Church, not necessarily a person alone per se. To the end of time, that spirit is available. Notice in Revelation 20, if I can tell you. Verses, I think, let's look at it. Revelation 20. Now, this translation that I have doesn't say it as well as it should. But maybe in the course of the day I'll be able to get it. The point is that that text clearly says that you have prophets until the close of time. Get it? Meaning that the spirit of prophecy is not limited to Ellen G. White. You may, now I needed to have done simply what is the spirit of prophecy biblically. If you want to get it, I'm giving that presentation in New Life, and it's on their coming Zoom. Just go there, you'll find my presentation there, where I show clearly biblically what is the spirit of prophecy and how it manifests itself until the end of time. And I show clearly that until the end of time, there will be the manifestation of the spirit of prophecy in certain ways. Because of time, I can't do it now, but I suggest that just visit Camp Meeting 2021 New Life and look at my presentations and you'll see it.
Pastor, I have a question.
Yes.
I've seen from this presentation, you say in 1840 the church grew by like 5 times, almost 5, because we began 1,000 to 5,500 believers. So that was within a year, if I may say so. But the other day when you were giving the statistics of Adventist believers, you said you are around 21 million.
2 million.
22 million.
Yeah, at the beginning of this year, but maybe we have gone because I mean more baptisms. The question sometimes is who are we baptizing? Maybe they're just baptizing that which is Yes.
So what is that really attributed with that tremendous growth in terms of the number of times, in particular 1840?
Sabbath keepers here are not Seventh-day Adventists. 1840 didn't have Adventists, you had Millerites. Sabbath keepers here are Baptists. Don't confuse the two. At 1840, in 1800, you had 1,000 Sabbath keepers, but they were not Seventh-day Adventists. As a matter of fact, Seventh-day Adventists were not existing. These were Baptist Christians, and they had embraced Sabbath keeping from 1664. Maybe came in active after I had said this. They came in from 1664, led by a man called Stephen Manford, who landed in Rhode Island, and he introduced the Sabbath keeping in US in 1664. So from 1664 up to 1800, you had only 1,000 Sabbath keeping Christians in the whole of US. Remember, the Seventh-day Adventist Church did not exist until after 1844. They came out of a branch called the Bridegroom Millerites. Your church came out of a branch that still believed that on 22nd of October 1844, something had happened in heaven. These were a minority, just about 300. They kept studying. There are many other groups. Some gave up hope altogether. So from this small group that still continued to think that something happened on 22nd of October 1844, they were called the Bridegroom Millerites that morphed into Seventh-day Adventists, because when Ellen and James White were taught by James Bates about the Sabbath, which James Bates had gotten from Rachel Oakes, and Rachel Oakes read the tract of the Baptists. You could say that Rachel Oakes was a Baptist, but then she joined the Millerite movement. And so because of that, she taught James Bates, and James Bates was one of the leading Millerites. It is out of that that Sabbath began to be taught. And Ellen White became a shepherd an ideologue leading and guiding the entire movement with regard to the sanctuary and the seventh-day Sabbath. From 1845, through her dreams, she began living out, standing up. Remember when I said that women were allowed to teach in public? That precedent had been set. So now Ellen White came to occupy that space, and she began to become a leader, leading the movement between 1845 and 1849. And the doctrines that were observed were basically three. One, that we are living in the times of the end, Jesus is about to come. Two, that the Sabbath was one of the distinctive features of those who are looking for the return of Jesus Christ. And three, that the sanctuary was an important doctrine. Of course, in the sanctuary there were subtopics like the cross of probation doctrine. They believe that before Jesus comes, probation will close, and then nobody will repent again. And for some time, they taught that in fact, the thinking was that those who had participated in 1844, 22nd of October, had their probation sealed, and everybody else was not supposed to be in heaven. Only these few would go to heaven. So, in 1844, you didn't have Seventh-day Adventists, you had Millerites. But in 1845, you had a branch from the Millerites called the Bridegroom Adventists. These are the ones that morphed over time into becoming Seventh-day Adventists. And the name Seventh-day Adventist was officially registered in 1861, and the church organized in 1863. So, in 1844, yes, there were 5,500 Sabbath-keeping Christians, but not Seventh-day Adventists. Right? The bell has been, was it the morning or the last? Yes, I see a question.
I've got one question.
Yes.
In my reading, I get to understand that the message that Ellen White has for us today was first presented to two people. Ellen White becoming the third person now to be used. Now, what implication or what message does it have for us that the first two people who approached with the message were men and rejected? Ellen White being the third, and a woman with an education of grade 3 now accept this message, and this far we are. What message should we read out of that?
Quite a number. That's a very good question. Quite a number. By the way, just for your record, there were 6, not even 3. There were 6. And I could give you other names of other people that were approached by an angel and they declined. Some of them were blacks. And so part of it was a stereotype that as a black I cannot, what can I say before a white-dominated America? Who am I? Number 2 is that I'm not well educated. Those who are not necessarily well educated people. And God, just like in the apostolic day, used fishermen to turn upside down the world of the then times. Peter, James, and the rest of them were not very educated people. God is consistent. He goes for the humble. These guys declined because they were arrogant. They believe that for you to be able to serve in the Lord's vineyard, you must have this title of wisdom. That's why I'm asking today, and I'm challenging all of us. Education is not a requirement. I'm not saying that it's not important. You had a Paul, you had a Daniel, you had a Moses, and you have many other scholars in the Bible. But God looks for someone who is humble to be used. And Ellen White was willing to be used. Being a woman, being a teenager, when she was trying to do it, she did it. And today, we have no excuse. Especially we are being told, go. If you're willing, if you say, God, I'm willing, God can pick on you and bypass Baraza, despite my training. My training doesn't qualify me. It's just a tool. What qualifies everyone is our surrender to God. When you surrender, He will turn you around and make you a giant in the annals of history. I see our time is up. Allow me to end at that. If I don't die soon, we can still continue this message. Shall we be upstanding as we pray? Let me ask Daktari if you can close for us in prayer, if you can give him a mic or something like that. I'm just feeling I've lost breath. I've been speaking too much. I think yesterday I did a lot of presentations until my rib cage almost collapsed. There were about 5 of them if you ask me.
Let us pray. We want to thank you, Heavenly Father, for this presentation. Thank you for Pastor Baraza. And thank you for reminding us the importance of scroll prophecy, where we've come from, where we are, and where we are heading. Help us to be towards of this one. Help us to keep your commandments through your Spirit, and help us to uphold the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is our prayer in Jesus' name.
Amen.